G'day legends, happy Monday. I hope that you are having a fantastic day and I hope that you also had a fantastic weekend. Now, of course, legends, as always, we have a lot to go over, but I fear this video may be longer than usual. So sit back, grab a beer. It's your time to do it now because we've got a lot to go over. Of course, we're going to look at 2 days of maps. Of course, we missed a video yesterday because I did a special on China's grand strategy. And if you want to have a look at that, I'll put a link down below. But we will be talking a little bit more about China today because it has been brought up by the Telegraph of how this war may influence China and how I believe the Western thinking around how China want to fight is really maybe misled at this point. And there's no country in the world that we have the history of China's strategy to look at over a 4,000-year period. So we'll be talking about that. Of course, in these 2 days of mapping that we missed, we'll compare maps, I'll show geolocations, and I want to have a look at a bit of footage that may tell us some more as well. The main, bulk of this video is going to be talking about Europe and Russia's industry. This war, like it or not, and a lot of people don't like it and won't accept it, what I believe has led to a lot of decisions made that have had a negative impact from not accepting a very hard truth that this war has become attritional and protracted. Now, in this, as I've shown you in Doctrine, one of your biggest elements is to be able to reconstitute your forces and, as well, provide the industrial output of this. And as we saw, the US European Command said the other day that Russia is producing in a month more shells than the US and Europe have in stockpiles. So we'll be going over that industry and how Russia's approach, Ukraine's approach, and the European approach have led to very different outcomes around privatization and remaining owned under public. And what we're looking at in this too, because some of the numbers in this article are skewed because they're not taking into account purchase power parity. And if you look at GDPs and it's not taking that into account, take it into account because some of the figures given, well, you'll look at and go, well, okay, on the surface, but if you can get several tanks for the price of that one, have we seen in this war that these more technologically advanced tanks are performing 7 times better? Or are the shells performing 7 or 8 times better when we take that into account? So we're looking at that. But where I want to start is a Telegraph article talking about peace, what the outcome may be. And this, of course, is an opinion piece. Now, you need to sort of read between the lines on this because it is heavily worded, very anti-Russia, but you need to read between the lines at what he is getting at here. And I've pulled out some bits. The bits that I've put in then quotation marks will be speaking about what the author is actually saying. But Trump is counting on a quick Ukraine peace deal, leaving Putin rubbing his hands. Now, last week, he let it be known that Trump was pissed off with Putin's foot dragging on a ceasefire. Still, it is more likely than not Ukraine will find itself facing an ultimatum. Either sign a Trump-brokered peace deal dictated by Putin or lose US intelligence and logistical support permanently. Now, again, this makes sense of why Putin may be dragging his feet. At the end of the day, if you come to a negotiated deal, it will be dictated by the situation on the ground at that given point. This is why Ukraine and its partners want to put Ukraine in a position of strength, so it can be dictated from that point. But at this point in time, the position of strength on the ground is in Russia's hands. Why do I say it makes sense for, at this point in time, Russia and Putin to then lengthen this deal? Because I think it plays into a lot of Trump's impatience with wanting to end this war too. We'll go over more of that. But we see here, Henry Kissinger, back in 2011, in this book, he's speaking about China and historical wars, but this is still relevant. The side that has the upper hand in war often has an incentive to delay a settlement, especially if every passing day improves its bargaining position. And I think with this, when we see then the deterioration on the front line, both sides in a in attritional war attriting down, but Russia at this point in time objectively is winning the attritional phase of warfare. Remember, they can afford a much larger loss ratio, and even that's questionable if it would even be 1-to-1, but regardless, that it's improving its bargaining chip as it goes on, both with then the situation on the ground and then Trump wanting to find a deal there as well as quickly as possible. Okay. Continue on because we've got more in this. Surrendering vast tracts of homeland without a fight would leave the Ukrainians dispirited. In an army that feels betrayed, defeatism spreads like wildfire. Zelensky's fall would be only a matter of time, followed by a dismemberment of his nation. And this is something that I have brought up a long time ago that I said was a real risk depending on how this war ends. And given the militias that we saw form in just recent memory, this could be a huge issue. Now, as well, if the settlement that comes is worse than what was proposed in 2022, this will cause a lot more unrest as well. But there's a few things that this settlement needs to be looked at for Ukraine beyond just what is territorial goals or what is seen as then legal territory borders. The settlement, I think, firstly, it needs to prevent 16 to 18-year-old men who have not been able to leave Ukraine under martial law. It needs to prevent them leaving as soon as possible, as soon as that is lifted. Now, that doesn't mean bringing in a law to hold those guys against their will. It means having it in a place that they will then choose to stay. Secondly, it needs to bring those millions that have fled Ukraine, women and children and the guys who don't want to fight and make YouTube channels about the war to benefit off the men who did want to fight. It needs to incentivize people to stay and people to come back. This again brings in what I call Zelensky's manpower paradox, is that this war is existential for Ukraine, which is correct, but not willing to mobilize the men because it could then jeopardize the future demographics. But without mobilizing those men, you're also jeopardizing the war, therefore future demographics. It's not making sense there. And if you're not willing to do it, well, I think you have to find other ways out. But as I've said, Ukraine is Ukraine, firstly due to the people, and secondly due to the territory. At what point in command, in politics, do you start threatening the demographics to the point of no return in trade for land, aka Pyrrhic victories? Once Putin had the initial plans fail and the resistance being far more than was expected, this then became their goal, that we will attrit Ukraine to the point that we end up getting our goal in time. There is potential that if the US withdraw and Europe continue then to trickle support as we have seen, and their industrial power, as I will show you in the future, is not up to par to then replace the US, and they should have done this years ago, and it's not going to be there, will allow further years of deterioration in an attritional battlefield. And at that point, and we may be at that point now, but we don't have good numbers, the very existence of the state in the future, even if peace comes into play, can then be in question due to then the demographic loss of attritional warfare. And with all of these, with unrest that may occur, then EU and NATO membership may then be further off the table. So there's a lot here in that acceptance of attritional style warfare. There are certainly plenty of Trump acolytes, such as Pentagon official Elbridge Colby, who want the US to focus primarily on containing China. Putin, they argue, might be tempted by lucrative deals with the US to abandon his alliance with Xi Jinping. Yet throwing Ukraine to the Russian bear would send the message to Beijing that Taiwan cannot rely on Trump as an ally. And this was my exact take on Trump wanting to draw Putin away from Xi. We see that Putin solves a lot of headaches for Xi and vice versa. But for Xi, Putin solves the headache of Arctic power as well as resources. So that pulling away, we definitely could see Trump doing some of that. Now, a lot of people will talk about Taiwan in this, and I believe that is somewhat incorrect. And we'll go a step further on this. The outcome of this conflict, it may influence China's plans for what we'd call the reunification of Taiwan, but it's not going to end it. China see an invasion on Taiwan and reunifying that with then mainland China, they don't see this as a international dispute. They don't see it as something anyone else should be interested in. They see it as a civil historical dispute. Of course, when the nationalists and the communists then broke off. And this is one that China, they historically, I don't believe they'll want to confront with military power if it can be avoided, and they may just look at taking a lot longer time to do this. But let's talk about China. We'll go back a step, talk about China, Putin, and Trump. Now, I've always said in this that I think there is a real risk with the imbalance of power that we see, that China is somewhat using Putin and then using other nations to get what they want. And I've said again and again for years, the ones who benefit the most off this war, who is not sending any troops, any hardware, any financial aid, but is receiving oil and gas at cheaper rates, still exporting everywhere, it is China. The ones who benefit the most out of this war is China. And very recently we have even seen and spoken about China looking of, maybe we will send peacekeepers, which I said, don't allow that. But this is a theory of which I'm going to touch on more. Now, this Wei Yin, he died in 234 AD, and he was a Chinese military general. But we see a lot in Chinese military history, this idea of let barbarians fight barbarians to then weaken this. And he's pointing this to Russia, France, America, and then wars going on at the time. And this is very, very interesting here because I think that China in this, we've seen that they're not taking a hardline position on Russia. They have a no limits friendship, nor are they taking a hardline position on Ukraine. They're taking into account their own 6-point peace proposal, which got turned down a couple of years ago. And I do believe that China has a lot to benefit, if not the most to benefit out of this war, on their military history of let barbarians fight barbarians. And what they'll be looking at is America, NATO, and Europe. Of course, that all encapsulates. They are being weakened by this war with all their shells and equipment going out. Russia is using a shitload of their equipment and a shitload of their men as well. And we have a lot to gain from this and not wanting to really have an end to the conflict because on China Sea, that barbarians fighting barbarians. Let me know what you think of that. I think it may be an interesting concept to go over in the future at length. So, look, let's have a look at then the maps for the past 2 days. So, of course, we have Ukraine in the center of your screen, the capital here of Kyiv. The red areas occupied since 22, the purple since 2014, the red check that you will see. That is ground made by the Russian forces over the past 24 hours. Blue is the opposite. We don't have any of this today. So the first place we're going to come down into is then the island boys of Rozliv. Now, again, we've seen over the past week this grow and grow just into this little part here. Realistically, what does this look like? I believe it probably looks like something like this. What is the most obvious here is probably how it is looking. I know people love titles and thumbnails of this and whatever, and I'm guilty of that as well, but realistically, the way we have seen Russia fighting, that acceptance of attrition, protracted warfare, grinding down, that will just move forward inch by inch onto that location. So it's probably looking like that, not the teleportation of Ivan and Svetlana. So where else are we going to look? Well, let's come up into Kursk straight away. Now, of course, we see Sudzha you'll be familiar with and Goaevo as well. No changes on this map, but remember there was that large change around Basivkia. But I have a geolocation that's just above the U here today. We see a Russian flag going up. So again, this is the geolocation. It sits basically just above the U, but in blue territory here. What we see is then Russian forces flying a flag from this completely destroyed then building. So it's a little bit hard to see as it is a bit clunky around here, but we can just see it out the window as then we come around. Again, difficult to see here, but you can see that flag there. Again, proving a geolocation that is then separate to the maps. And we have seen a few geolocations around Goaevo the last few days and over the last week as that continues to grind down. So there are some talk about further advancements into Belgorod. Again, I don't have any maps that are showing that today. Let's then move into the northeast. Now, ignore this for now because we're going to go back to yesterday and then we'll click this on. And then what we see is around Kamyanka, just like Syriac map showed the other day, there is then a Russian advancement in this direction. Let's have a look on the Syriac map from then today, and very similar direction again. Russian army made new advances in the southern part of Kamyanka. That's further advances again, because the other part was just, I believe, to the east of here slightly. So we see that as well as that grey zone to the west of there. But let's stay up here because, as we saw before, if we go then to today, we have around Zapadne red check showing a further Russian advance to the west here, further then broadening that crossing across the Oskil, of course, threatening areas like Kupiansk, but then plunging deeper and deeper into the Kharkiv Oblast as well, where we see that Ukraine's once 1,000-kilometre squares that's come down to 60 at the very most in Kursk is now being far outweighed by what Russia hold in Kharkiv, an area of which we know from what they are proposing as peace they don't want to hold, so there could be a swap back in here. Now, we'll continue our way down, of course, the Oskil, and we come then to Terni. This is an area which we need to keep an eye on because we saw this spire head out to then the northwest. So let's have a look at a couple of maps here. So if we go back to yesterday and then we turn this on, we see out of Nevsky, we see ground being made on the Deep State map. That is then further confirmed with then the Syriac map. Of course, he's showing that all of this grey zone in here has come under control and it's gone from that spire to being then widened out. Of course, so you don't get cut off. You can't just push in one area. But Deep State, they have raised some concerns around this in that exact area we showed you, that the enemy continues to advance in the Liman area. The situation in this section continues to escalate. The enemy is advancing, having an advantage in the area. In particular, assault operations are being carried out in the direction of Novo-Myalkivka and Nevsky area where the enemy was successful. Similarly, the Russians were successful in the Novaya area and constant pressure is being exerted on Katanivka. Unfortunately, the situation on this section is not going well for the defence forces of the Ukrainians. The ineffective use of resources by the brigade holding the area of responsibility, poor situational awareness, and the superiority of the Russians in drones and damage capabilities are evident. So artillery, FABs, drones. The success of Russians is also enhanced by the infantry, which exerts constant pressure on the positions of the Ukrainian military. So the situation is deteriorating and needs to be saved. Line of combat contact on this section is undergoing certain changes. And we did speak about how this exact area has been under a lot of pressure ever since the Russians reached the Oskil to north of here, out from Pishani at one point here. They reached the Oskil, they cut this into a north and south element, and now trying to push on that and the logistical struggles that creates. So let's continue moving our way down the map. And I believe the next place we will get to is then Bakhmut. Now, to the north of Bakhmut, of course, we have Soledar, very famous area, and then this Yusia-Kivkia that sits right in here. Now, Syriac maps, he has just clarified on this as he showed this under control, but he says on the Soledar front, it was confirmed the Russian army failed to consolidate on the western outskirts of Vasyl-Kivkia in an assault mid-March. The locality remains under control of the Ukrainian army. So just clarifying his position there. But of course, from the west of Bakhmut, we have Chasiv Yar. Now, no changes shown on this map today, but we do have some changes shown on then the Syriac map. So we look on this situation, Chasiv Yar, Russian army made new advances south of Zakirny district, close to the locomotive depot. So it's a little bit difficult to see in here, but if we zoom in on Chasiv Yar, see where this reservoir is, it's just in this sector, the automotive depot, that is coming under control. Of course, on this map here, you can see how this can create a lot of challenges for the center industrial part of Chasiv Yar itself. So, of course, we'll keep an eye on that as we go. Now, let's continue moving our way down, and then we'll get to Toretsk. Now, I believe yesterday, yes, we did. We saw an update in Toretsk by Red Check on then the western outskirts in these buildings. Of course, a lot of this by other maps has come under control, but again, we know that it is very fluid on this front line day to day because Russia was not able to consolidate the occupation. Ukraine had successful counter actions in here, And it's been difficult to know because even Ukrainian pages said no, there wasn't counter-actions. It was just never held. So again, we don't know. But Suryak map, they have a map update here as well. Toretsk front, the last 48 hours, Russian army recaptured some parts of this district. The line of the front was corrected in favour of the Ukrainian army. This, of course, is in this coming in where then the oval is in the centre here. Also, Russian forces made advances around Tetikon number 10. So in this sector as well as around the Tetikon number 10 here too. So just wait out on Toretsk, as I've been saying for a while, you just need to sort of hold your horses, wait out on that, because that is, at this point in time, I believe, probably the most difficult place to actually know what is shifting where. Now, Pokrovsk, Lysivkia, it does show on the deep state map that the Russian armed forces have entered then Lysivkia, potentially occupying there as well in the direction of Pokrovsk. Then we have the Suryak maps in here. Now, of course, here's showing as well, Russian forces took control of the eastern part of Lysivkia, so we can confirm that advancement, but that the Russian forces recaptured Solone. Remember, this map never showed, but Suryak was saying that Solone had come back under control of the Ukrainian forces, as well as then Uspenivkia, but he's showing Uspenivkia has come back under control of the Russians, as well as Solone. So again, as always, you see my difficulty. It's hard to know what's happening, as well as just to the north of here in Kotlene, that up to the railway here is coming back under control of the Russians, according to Mr. Suryak maps. Now let's move our way further down. We see the island teleportation buoys, but where we need to come is an area you're familiar with. Well, maybe not. Depends who you watch, because a lot of people never accepted the loss of Velika Novosilka, so I guess that holds. But we've seen, of course, movements to the north and a lot of changes here recently, but you need to be aware of Shevchenko. And something that I have been saying is in the south of Ukraine, there's a lot of resources. And of course, we see resource deals, and of course, Russia wants to get their hands on some of that also. So, stay with me. Situation on this front. During the last 3 days, Russian army made new advances west and northwest of Berlatsky, here, taking control over a series of positions at the eastern outskirts of Shevchenko. So movements onto the eastern outskirts of Shevchenko. Again, we can't confirm this until we either get geolocations or multiple maps showing it. But we see Suryak saying this. With the latest advance, the Russian army reached lithium depot at the eastern outskirts of Shevchenko. Again, I've spoken about other lithium deposits down further south around just to the north of Lobkovy, and we may see increased pushing there to try and gain that position, occupy that can play into Ukraine and Russia's mineral deal, as well as potential Russian mineral deals with the US, which, to slide one, will likely come into play because then Trump may offer Putin a good deal to try and draw him away from China. And this is the time to do it. While America's economy is really dropping, while there are a lot of uncertainty in the world, Putin may be able to get a better deal. Now, this is some footage that I've seen floating around overnight, and I'm still unsure what to think about. And I thought, well, what better to display it to my audience and say, what have you seen this before, or what do you believe of this? So this is being reported as American soldiers, which we can hear, then not American soldiers, but Americans fighting in Ukraine, of a Russian unidentified aircraft here, some are saying a Su-34, dropping bombs on Ukrainian positions here in a close air support role. They're exploding here, then we can hear them come through right there, speed of sound coming through, and then we see a surface-to-air missile come from the right to left of your screen, then engaging this aircraft. Now, we don't know if the aircraft was engaged or not. We don't have any then clarification on this. But Fighter Bomber, who is very reliable when it comes to this, he says, beautiful video, it's a shame you're lying. I haven't seen a better piece of work. But with the rate at which this business is developing, in a year or two, it will almost be impossible to distinguish a real photo or video from a fake. So is this a fake? And this could be a turning point, because to me, this looks unbelievably real. And this isn't any video game that I've seen. Maybe it is AI. So potentially this is a unbelievable fake that could trick millions around the world. And of course, this is what we're going to see with the future development of artificial intelligence, is fakes indistinguishable from real. And people like me, we're absolutely screwed because of it, because it's just going to have me saying whatever wild shit But could it be a fake, or is it earlier in the war? Or if it is real, what we see then is that Russian bomber aircraft like that are dropping munitions right on very frontline positions. So again, hopefully we can get some clarification on what exactly that footage is. Is it a fake? That should be concerning. Is it a Russian aircraft being operating right on those front lines and dropping munitions, and we haven't heard about any very recent losses there? Again, there's a lot in that. So let's talk about industry. And this then RUSI paper that has come out in the past couple of days called Winning the Industrial War, comparing Russia, Europe and Ukraine. And we see this is written by Alexander Danilyuk, and he has worked in Ukraine's foreign ministry, and Jack Waitling as well. So with anything like this, especially if it's post-2022, you need to take things with a grain of salt and add your own education and thoughts onto it too, because of course there's so much that is biased. Just have a look at ISW and things that they have said that now we're like, where the fuck did you pull that out of your ass if you're serious analysts? Okay, so again, it starts with that as a disclaimer, but there are some really good parts in this that we need to talk about. So we'll look over the executive summary, the conclusion, and then we'll talk about then industry and differences too, and how we should have known this, that it was very obvious, anyone who'd looked back in history too. Protracted wars are won by the party able to generate new competitively trained forces and the armaments with which they are equipped and sustained. The ability to generate a second and third echelon of forces is an important aspect of states' deterrence posture. Again, it is who can regenerate their forces and who can have the highest low-end army. The army you start with, sadly, is not going to be the army you end the war with. We'll have more doctrine around that later. During Russia's full-scale invasion of Ukraine, the Russian defense industry has managed to significantly increase defense production. Ukraine has also done this, although to a lesser extent. European members of NATO, meanwhile, face substantial problems in expanding defense industrial output despite an abundance of funds. This paper examines the processes of military-industrial mobilization in each of these areas to assess the causes of radically different outcomes. So what we see is an abundance of funds in Europe, but are we seeing that translate into abundance of material? Not really. Firstly, Russia, they had a well-developed plan for military-industrial mobilization, which it implemented early in the war. Ukraine did not have such a well-developed plan, but could draw on its Soviet legacy to regenerate industrial capacity. Europe, meanwhile, lacked both a plan and the data with which to build one. This made investment into defense production inefficient. So where do we even put that money that we have bought up for this war? And like I see, what we saw in that is when Russia accepted very early that this is going to go for years, it's attritional, it will become protracted, we saw them then put into place those plans, and this was the mobilization of forces, then money moving into industry, and if need be, then taking over of industry into the public sector to produce then military equipment. Okay. Second, Russia and Ukraine maintained a highly centralized level of coordination over their respective defense industries and had an understanding of the supply chains to enable a relatively coherent orchestration of investments. Europe, meanwhile, lacked control and could only incentivize industry. While governments, industry, lacked an understanding of their own supply chains, leading to massive internal competition and uneven expansion. Third, while Russia did achieve a much more efficient military-industrial mobilization, it also cost far more than was generally acknowledged. Russia has not only expanded defense spending, but also rerouted money from other budgets to expand military-industrial recapitalization and has advanced credit to defense companies to enable rapid growth. This will pose challenges in the medium term. It is not reasonable to expect Europe, which is not at war, to mobilize investments to a comparable level. Now, in this will be the post-war attrition too for Russia, is they spend a lot of money. They'll need to continue spending a lot of money to refill that. So there will be, of course, medium-term challenges economically too. Now, in this, Europe is not at war. Now, Europe, they love to say this. People love to say this. But if you are providing from weapons to targeting to information to every single aspect of this, and you are saying that this war is existential for the existence of our states, I think to say that they are not at war is incorrect. Europe may not be at hot war with Russia. You're at best at a Cold War, realistically probably at a lukewarm bath war at this point in time. But this idea just not to acknowledge that at all, no, well, it's over there, that we keep seeing Europe do, that it's Ukraine at war, we're just helping out, I think is having a negative effect this far in. However, the fragmentation of the European defence market has meant that money is spent very inefficiently. Greater European coordination and spending could improve the return on investment. Remember, you've got multiple different countries in this. You've got over 20 countries all wanting their own piece of the pie. The regulatory environment in Russia and Ukraine should not be held up as a model. In Ukraine, regulation of core defence industries has necessitated a large unregulated non-traditional defence ecosystem to emerge. In Russia, practices are manifestly unsafe and often have led to accidents. But this deregulation means it is a lot cheaper also. Now, I'm not speaking here from then the workers in the factory, but that deregulation, of course, deregulation, then can make things a lot cheaper. I'll show you in the beginning. I'll show you a little bit further on. In Europe, however, the burden of regulation is also self-defeating in raising the cost and slowing the production of equipment. Incentives for stockpiling equipment and taking risk, meanwhile, are skewed in such a way as to lead to systemic policy failure, regulatory reform, and harmonisation for testing, procurement, storage, and transportation of defence material. These are essential. So again, in this, the stockpiling of equipment and not focusing on R&D, these have, of course, led to then inefficient practices because it's such a privatised market. In an environment where Europe must be able to deter Russia with reduced US support, Russia's full-scale invasion of Ukraine should spur significant efforts to address what has been demonstrated to be a manifestly inaccurate defence industrial base. And what we have seen is Europe's industrial base adequate for deterrence of Russia without US? No, it's not. And we have seen in this limited conflict at the moment that is, as to use these words, manifestly inadequate for that deterrence. Now, none of this is surprising when we compare Soviet and NATO doctrine. The Soviets, they worked on a quantity is a quality of its own approach. And systems were made with less advanced technology to allow rapid expansion. Simplicity being the key to mobilising a large force. This goes from tanks to ground forces, that it is simpler systems, but you can mobilise and train that or build it much, much more quickly. There's also problems with that heavily public funded and public overreach too. That does reduce the amount of development that can occur also, but different approaches. In a land war in Europe, we see this was the correct thinking. Ukraine has not suffered from a lack of technology or quality. Ukraine has suffered from an insufficient quantity. Privatised defence military industrial complexes, this naturally rewards R&D and future thinking, of course, monetarily, which can reduce corruption and it can increase the technology in such items. But this comes at the expense of much higher costs. In somewhere like Russia with centralised control, this may lead to corruption and this can also limit innovation. But of course, it can lead to a lower cost and then products being potentially a lot more simple but then efficient when we take into the whole spending cycle also. No one before 2022 would have been surprised at Russia's ability to ramp up industrial production. No one pre this would be surprised to see, hey, Russia is a massive industrial country that can build a lot of stuff. Now people are completely surprised and shocked by this. Again, like I've said, the propaganda has poisoned many perceptions. Lastly, European Union leaders say that this war determines Europe's future and describe it as existential to themselves. They provide direct targeting assistance, weapons. And as I say, Europe, they are at war with Russia. However, what we see even in this is that the European rhetoric and the reality is vastly different. Of what they then say versus how they are acting is different and having a negative effect. This applies, of course, to human resources, but the provision of an adequate volume of weaponry and military equipment is just as important. Numerical superiority in troops, their training and high morale do not matter if these troops do not have arms and ammunition. War is not only an art, but also a science. This is especially true of long wars, which are determined ultimately by the second and third echelon. Assessing the military balance of second and third echelon forces, and thus the capacity of a state to sustain a long war, is not as simple as measuring wealth and industrial potential. We go over this here. There had been a persistent narrative in parts of NATO that Russia is an insignificant threat because the GDP of NATO countries alone is 46 trillion, which is also half of the world GDP. By Russia comparison, the GDP of approximately $2 trillion, representing 2% of global GDP, an economy smaller than Canada's. The military threat from Russia was often dismissed on the basis that it had an economy the size of Italy. We see this again and again. Now, again, we need to take into account PPP, the purchasing power parity, because if we look at this, we see that this isn't half of the world GDP. You look at countries like BRICS, people don't want to bring this up because it goes against some narratives. So, Russia, $2 trillion. By World Bank figures, purchase power parity, their GDP is 6.45 trillion. By the International Monetary Fund, 6.5 trillion. So somewhere in that. So a lot more than you are claiming here is the actual purchasing potential of that money, where Italy, with this, is around 2.9 trillion. So no, we see the actual worth of that money is over double. This complacency is evident in the fact that as Russian defense spending expanded by some 227% and China's by 566% from 2000, defense spending across Europe and Canada continued to decline until 2014 and then was stable until 2022. Despite Russia's comparative economic weakness, Russia has still managed to outproduce NATO in military material through 22-24. Makes more sense when you take into account these real numbers here and the discount that you get for a very centralized, controlled system there. Even with significant efforts in some NATO member states to expand defense production, this reflects the challenges of aligning political will, regulatory and legislative enablement, industrial planning and capacity, and understanding and control over supply chains. Russia's continuing advantage in defense production poses a strategic threat to NATO and the credibility of its conventional deterrence. It poses a catastrophic risk for Ukraine since its international partners have become its strategic depth. Ukraine's strategic depth is the West. And this is why I say the center of gravity for Russia sits in Moscow. The center of gravity for Ukraine sits outside of Ukraine in the West. Now, this creates a safety net for that, but it also creates that is then very able to be changed quickly by democratic countries. So that domestic production, that's where that strategic depth sits and can shift on a dime like we've seen just with shifting American administration. So let's talk about this idea that we see of then the second and third echelon. And this is from the Protracted and Attritional War. I think it's called The Art of Protracted War. But in this, it's to get mobilization after that initiation of hostilities. This leads directly to a high-low mixture. Professional forces from the high-end army, so before the army, they become fire brigades, moving sector to sector in battle to stabilize the situation and conduct decisive attacks. Low-end formations, which should get developed over a number of years, they hold the line, they gain experience slowly. You increase their quality until they gain the capability to become then these professional soldiers and conduct then offensive operations. In this, victory is attained by creating the highest quality low-end formations as possible. And Australia is a good example of this. There was a recent paper come out talking about the Australian forces, the Australian professional forces, that if there was an invasion into Australia and a landing, that the existing professional soldiers would basically be split in two. One would be to go to delay that as much as possible and give time for the ones who haven't done that to then train the reserve to build up then the highest quality low-end formation possible. So a delay force, a training force to try and then stop that as much as possible. Let's go into the conclusion of this. Now you can go and look at this whole thing if you'd like on Russi. Comparing Russian, European, Ukrainian defence industrial response to the 2022 full-scale invasion of Ukraine reveals important lessons on how to effectively translate investment into defence industrial output. On preparation, one of the clear differences between Russia, Europe and Ukraine is that Moscow had a mobilisation plan and stockpiles from which to draw. The mobilisation plan included legislative changes. The Russian industrial mobilisation process was largely successful. Ukraine lacked such a clear plan, but had many of the same mechanisms in place due to its Soviet legacy. It was therefore able to implement a level of industrial mobilisation, albeit at a slower rate. European states had no plan or did not activate it, nor did they have the data to rapidly develop and execute a plan. This lack of preparedness meant that European states were slow and took many false steps, therefore a lot of wasted money and time as well. The lesson is simple. NATO members need industrial annexes to their national defence plans, and these should be deconflicted between members. The contrast in government involvement in military industrial processes is highly important. In Russia and Ukraine, the government retained an extremely high level of ownership over defence enterprises, which allowed them to be highly responsive to government direction, but also allows a lot of corruption there as well, because you don't have the competition in the market. In the US, the law allows the government to direct companies to service the defence industries only after certain things have been ticked off. I'm guessing in Europe they'd be similar, but because there's never been that we are at war or mobilisation of that fund, they can't implement some of that legislation too. In Europe, in aggregate, large sums of money were made available. However, the investments in each country represents very modest increases in investment, such that they have not stimulated a proportional increase in defence manufacture. Relatively small one-off orders have generally not incentivised the defence sector to expand its production capacity. Because if you have one order of 100,000 shells, Rheinmetall is going to go, that's great, but are we going to employ all these other people and build a whole other factory when we don't know if that's going to last any longer than that? Investment has also overwhelmingly focused on products rather than fundamentals in the supply chain. So where is the energy, where is the steel, not we just want the shell, such that investment has driven competition in the higher tiers of the supply chain and increased cost rather than expanded output. So we've seen a massive increase in cost and the output hasn't shifted as much as people would like to see. The profile of investment, therefore, has been poorly suited to enabling an expansion of defence industrial output. European countries should not embark on a level of mobilisation at the expense of the wider economy as pursued in Russia, and the prioritisation of research and development spending in many European enterprises has undoubtedly produced highly capable weapons. However, NATO does emphasise the importance of deterrence to prevent the outbreak of war. Deterrence is psychological. In this context, the European response to the invasion may be deemed a failure. Russia assessed the policies that were pursued and deemed them inadequate. It is worth emphasising that a relatively modest increase in expenditure across NATO could have had a significant effect on Russia's calculus if that money translated into tangible outputs. So their calculus has gone, yep, we see that the deterrence is not meeting that, therefore we are going to move on X objective. And of course, there's a lot of these calculations being run around a lot of other sectors also. Perhaps the greatest difference and the most important area of policy consideration is that Russia and Ukraine ultimately have a single authority responsible for the enterprise. In Europe, each country is too small to be self-sufficient, but there is no multinational coordination of the defence industry. Member states have opposed the EU playing such a role. So you've got 27 separate industries all buying for the same then contracts. It creates a mess. You don't have one large piece together. But the problem is Europe in history has never been completely unified. Even the EU, if you believe that is completely unified on the same trajectory, you're kidding. You're listening to von der Leyen and that idiot Kaja Kallas. That NATO, they lack the authorities information to do this as well. As competitors, European defence enterprises tend to be very secretive about their capacity with both other governments and other companies. The result is there is neither efficiency nor the data and authorities anywhere to rationalise the process. Coherence of multinational supply chains is the interest of all European NATO members if they need to transition to war. So whether in NATO or the EU, the establishment of an entity with this responsibility seems critical. If Europe wishes to deter war, it must demonstrate that it is developing the capacity to wage it. So that deterrent psychological of having X amount of whatever. It should also be noted that the cost of energy has massively driven up the cost of production, and that competition from external areas has ended the market flat out with, a lot of the time, a better and cheaper product. This is exactly what we saw happen in Poland. Poland did not buy from Rheinmetall in Germany. They bought from Hanwha in South Korea. From everything I'm hearing, a cheaper and better than system in tanks and SPG. Clearly see, as stated in this article, typo, that the UK still cannot meet their 105mm shell targets. And this is a very small war compared to what it would be if there was spillover or other states enter. If we want to look at a great state conflict, we realistically would be out of shells within days. But you need to incentivize output, not just R&D, and private companies buying for contracts and having then investors and shareholders' value to uphold. We see incentivization into R&D, not just in then output. We saw General Cavoli, of course, he is US-EU command, on August 5th, then say this about actual output. Russia is not just reconstituting service members, but also replacing combat vehicles and munitions at an unprecedented rate. They've lost 3,000 tanks, but they're on pace to replace them all. The Russian Defense Industrial Base is expected to roll out 1,500 tanks. Comparatively, the US, they only produce 135 tanks per year. We anticipate Russia to produce 250,000 shells per month, which puts it on track to build a stockpile 3 times greater than the US and Europe combined. So we see this in here, we mix with this, and you go, there's real problems. Again, this is just Russia with claimed GDP of Italy, if you don't take into account that, but still not a behemoth GDP like the US or China. But imagine what China's output could be if there was a great state war. Like we said, you'd be out of shells in days, and that goes into the idea of as long as China can survive the first few days, they will win. If just technology won wars, a lot more people would be speaking German. As this points out in this clearly, it needs to be some real look at policy as well and go, what are we actually then building to deter war? Because if we're just focusing on the absolute pinnacle of technology, that isn't going to be relevant if your whole front line is just falling apart. Legends, I hope you have a fantastic day, and I will speak to you tomorrow. Thank you. Bye-bye.